All right, take three. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. This episode is about something dystopian fiction understands deeply. The moment a government stops seeing people as human beings and starts seeing them as resources, not citizens, not neighbors, not individuals with memories, desires, or histories, just functions, a labor unit, a reproduction unit, a security threat, a statistic, and once that shift happens, identity itself becomes potentially dangerous to the system. We've seen this idea across dystopian fiction for decades. In 1984, by George Orwell, the state doesn't just control laws or economics, it tries to control reality itself. Memory becomes political, language becomes political, even facial expressions become political. The terrifying part of Orwell's world is not only the surveillance cameras or the thought police, it's the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the files, the quiet administrative machinery that slowly erases the person underneath the citizen. The individual is reduced to a state managed identity. Your past can be rewritten, your future can be predetermined, your body belongs first to the system. And while 1984 is fiction, history gives us uncomfortable parallels that make the comparison to 1984 seem all too accurate. In the Soviet Great Purge under Joseph Stalin, photographs were literally altered to erase political enemies from history. Former allies disappeared from public records as though they had never existed, and personal identity became conditional upon state approval. In North Korea today, generations of families can still face collective punishment for political disobedience. Loyalty to the state overrides loyalty to family, religion, or selfhood. And during the Cultural Revolution in China, citizens were pressured to denounce teachers, parents, and cultural traditions in favor of ideological conformity. Cultural heritage itself became suspect. That's one of the central truths that dystopian stories keep warning us about. Authoritarian systems don't merely demand obedience, they demand replacement. They replace memory with propaganda, family with ideology, and culture with state approved narratives. So fewer things become naturalistic, a lot of stuff becomes forced, and eventually the body itself becomes political territory. The idea appears powerfully in The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which admittedly I regretfully have not read, but I understand the basic premise. It's a world where reproductive control becomes the foundation of political power. The state decides who may reproduce, who may love, who may speak, who may exist publicly, and the body stops being personal. And again, fiction too often echoes reality. Governments throughout history have attempted to regulate bodies in ways that served state goals over individual autonomy. You've got forced sterilization programs that happened in the United States, Canada, Sweden, and elsewhere that targeted marginalized populations under the banner of public health or social improvement. In Nazi Germany, the eugenics program was a thing where the state weaponized biological ideology to horrific extremes. And mandatory conscription has also long reflected the idea that citizens' bodies can be requisitioned by the state. In wartime, governments often frame bodily sacrifice as patriotic duty. Even today, debates about surveillance technology, biometric databases, facial recognition systems, and reproductive legislation raise difficult questions about how much authority these institutions should hold over physical autonomy. Dystopian fiction magnifies these fears because they already exist and recognizable form, and in some cases, the reality actually outpaces fiction in terms of the real life horrors that are inflicted. The relatable horrors are more relatable because reality can sometimes be worse than what we might read on the page or see on the screen. And what makes these systems especially powerful is not just force, it's internalization. Citizens begin policing themselves, thinking that, they need to reel their true thoughts in or else they might get busted. People learn what not to say, what not to wear, what not to listen to or watch, what not to remember. And eventually, the state no longer needs constant violence because fear becomes automatic. This is one reason Orwell's phrase, Big Brother, remains culturally powerful. Surveillance changes behavior even when no one is actively watching. And of course, surveillance as a general phenomenon is more plausible nowadays because we have cameras everywhere. We can see softer versions of this dynamic in real life through mass social pressure, censorship fears, or systems where public disagreement carries professional or social consequences. Now, I'm not saying consequences are never a good thing. I'm not going to go to that extreme, but there's always a danger that the court of public opinion takes things a little too far, maybe is a little unjust, maybe is very unjust in some cases. You know, uh, you can have maybe a literal lynch mob that gets involved because of the court of public opinion. You know, extreme things can happen based on what is a popular premise at the time. While democratic societies are fundamentally different from totalitarian states, or so we are told, dystopian fiction asks us to remain alert to any structure that rewards conformity while punishing independent thought. Because once self censorship becomes habitual, identity starts shrinking quietly from the inside. And again, it's one of those complicated things because sometimes maybe you do want to censor yourself. And, I'll use a less dramatic example. Like, if you're with your grandparents or whatever, you're probably not going to be talking about like an adult movie that you watched or something like that. You're probably going to tone it down. And that is basically self censorship, right? And would you say that that's always a bad thing to do? Not always, but it can be a bad thing, though. Depending on the circumstance. Dystopian stories almost always leave cracks in the system, and that's important. No regime is completely successful at eliminating individuality, though they might try. In 1984, Winston keeps a diary, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, people memorize books to preserve forbidden knowledge. And in The Handmaid's Tale, they preserve identity through things like memory and private thought. And these acts all look small, but totalitarian systems fear such small acts because they restore inner ownership. A forbidden language or forbidden words and ideas, a hidden photograph, an old song, a secret gathering, all those things. These become acts of resistance. And real history reflects this as well. During the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, many families secretly preserved banned national traditions and languages despite political pressure to assimilate. In apartheid era South Africa, art, music, and literature became tools of cultural resistance. Under dictatorships in Latin America, families of the disappeared publicly carried photographs of loved ones as an act of defiance against state erasure. And identity survives in fragments, and those fragments really they end up mattering more than you might think. There's another reason dystopian systems eventually crack. Human beings are not naturally designed for permanent ideological conformity and uniformity. People seek meaning beyond utility. They want love that isn't assigned by policy, beliefs that are not state issued, and memories that belong to them alone and their unique experiences. That's why personal relationships are often portrayed as politically dangerous in dystopian fiction. Winston and Julia's relationship in 1984 threatens the party because it redirects loyalty away from Big Brother. Love creates private allegiance, and private allegiance can weaken total control. Authoritarian systems understand this instinctively. Throughout history, highly controlling regimes have often attempted to dominate education, religion, sexuality, family structure, and even friendship networks because independent emotional bonds create alternative centers of identity. And Albert Camus once wrote, "Become so very free that your whole existence is an act of rebellion." And that line captures the heartbeat of dystopian literature, not rebellion through violence alone, but rebellion through personhood, to remember your own name, to preserve truth, to love honestly, and to refuse reduction into a category or a function. Dystopian stories last because they ask a question that never really disappears. What happens when institutions become more important than the humans they govern? And the answer these stories repeatedly give is this: systems can dominate bodies for a time, they can manipulate language, rewrite history, and force fear, but they struggle to fully extinguish the human need for self definition. That need survives underground, in memory, in art, in love, in truth telling, and in the quiet insistence that a person is more than what the state says they are. And once enough people remember that, even the strongest systems begin to fracture. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and I hope you like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff because that's very exciting, isn't it? You know, you get to have the pleasure of uh, possibly getting more of my episodes out there. And yeah, all right. Have a good one.